the basic elements of trust, consistency, transparency. There will be fewer companies that are kind of actively jumping into those, but the ones that do are the ones that will still be there 5 years from now. We saw this in the arc of customer experience starting in 2006, 2007. There was an inflection point around 2012. And the companies that said customer experience isn't just a catchphrase or an idea, it's really core to what we do. And they invested in it, not flashy, but very consistently and deliberately. Those were the companies that 2, 3, 4 years later were skyrocketing, companies like Delta Airlines.
Megan, very excited to have you as a guest. For those who don't know Megan Byrne, she is a customer experience and trust expert. I love that. A keynote speaker, exec advisor, and for some of you who maybe think I know that name, Megan is a former Forrester VP and Principal Analyst. So a huge welcome, Megan, to Trusted Voices. Very excited about this conversation. So we're going to start, as we do start with Trusted Voices, and I'd just love to find out what brand you're advocating for, if any, at the moment, and see what it is. Intrigued.
Yeah, I had to think about this because you probably the same. I'm kind of hyper attuned to what brands do. So, but the one that I would say I'm advocating right now for is Away, the luggage brand.
Never heard of them.
So they're probably about a 10-year-old brand. And I travel a lot, and their suitcases, it's funny, you see them, virtually everyone in the airport has them now. They're everywhere, but they're very thoughtfully designed, high quality. They have warranties. I've had the smaller one for years. I was traveling to Europe, and I said, all the reviews I read about what's called the bigger carry-on said, it's amazing how much you can fit in this. And of course, I was skeptical because I always am. And it really is true how much more I was able to pack for a 5-day trip to London in this. And I also have 2 of their other bags. My everyday bag is one of theirs, and I have another carry-on, and it's just simple, good quality, no fluff and frills. The one time I had an issue with one of my suitcases, they replaced it, and it's just overall a solid company.
Love it. Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So we're going to start with some other questions. And I love you saying they're positioned as a trust expert. So that got my attention immediately and following some of your posts. So you've obviously spent a long time researching, understanding the depths of customer experience and what I'm particularly interested in human behavior. Why do you think trust has become more prevalent? And I know I'm attuned to it, all these conversations, and has become one of the biggest determinants in business success in B2B. What's your view on, your sweet spot here?
There's a couple of different factors that have been contributing to it. One is scale, right? We're built to trust other humans. And as companies have gotten bigger and bigger, and we've gotten sort of more distant from the actual humans, especially with digital, that just makes it harder and less likely to trust. Most of the signals that we're tuned into to say, is this a trustworthy person or an organization, they're at least tamped down, if not absent, in digital interactions. Some of it is also, quite frankly, bad behavior. There have been a lot of companies that have been untrustworthy. So business has kind of conditioned us to expect the hidden fees. What's the catch? So organizations that do excel at trust stand out. It's more unique. Even organizations that aren't intentionally exhibiting bad behavior, just the complexity of things, it's become a lot harder to be consistent and reliable. And those are 2 of the key elements of trust. And then the social factors as well, for a whole variety of reasons, including the digital. We've just become less trusting of other people. And so there's this pervasive air of skepticism, both about other humans and about organizations, that is making it harder in a lot of cases to build and maintain trust in various industries.
Is it a lack of trust in people, or a lack of trust in the content as well? Because I found myself, and I don't know if anybody else, but I found myself over Christmas, you end up scrolling or you end up on this. And then halfway through watching something, I'm like, that's not real. But it looks so real. And I'm getting really, really annoyed by it, to be honest. And it's just like, this is not real. This is, oh, yeah,
Yeah,
frustrating.
AI has certainly accelerated that. I think so in the research that I've done, when there are two human beings in a relationship, trust is much more likely to be there than when it is me looking at a company's content distantly.
Hmm.
It also depends a lot on sort of where you are in the social structure. There are some people who are more inclined to distrust other people's content, no matter how much proof they provide. So, it's kind of all of the above. I think it's also important to recognize that trust is not one thing. We trust a person or an organization to do something or to not do something, right? If the content is fake, that's a problem because we're trusting an organization to represent their products and services and value accurately. So
Yeah.
if the content is fake, then we're pretty sure that they're not doing that. If it's an opinion, someone who's giving an opinion about something, we wonder if the opinion is genuine or if it's been, modified to some extent. So what do we trust people to do is also part of that equation of how much we trust, whether it's a human or a content.
Yeah, it's hard. It's
Mhm.
hard to build trust then at the moment. Where do you think organizations think they're building trust, but maybe they aren't? What have you seen from your experience?
Yeah, I think the humanity side of things is really where the biggest gap is. We often think, and I would put myself in this category because I'm human, we judge ourselves by our intentions and we judge other people by their behavior. So we know and believe that we care about people and we see people as individuals, but that doesn't necessarily come through to them. They don't necessarily always feel that. We're terrible at evaluating emotional intent in email and digital content. Even happily married couples that have been happily married for 50 years misinterpret the emotional
Yeah.
intent of a spouse's email. So the humanity is part of it. Another part of it is I think the ease of doing business. I think a lot of companies think that they are easier to do business with than they are, in part because they tend to focus on, sort of the sunny day or straightforward scenarios. And they assume knowledge, curse of knowledge, they assume that customers know and understand things that customers do not, in fact, know or understand. So I think there's just an unintentional but very real gap in how easy companies are to do business with.
And how do companies, if it's unintentional, how do companies find that out? Is that how you help them? Or what does an organization do? Someone out there might be thinking, yeah, we're really trustworthy. We're really make it easy for our customers.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons, frankly, that customer experience has become such a discipline over the last 20 years. I talk about it as being similar to fitness trackers. Many of us didn't realize how little we moved
Mm.
until we got a tracker that told us how little we moved. And so just becoming self-aware and self-sensing, whether that's through analytics, customer feedback. I've been in journey mapping workshops where I was teaching a team about journey mapping, and the senior leader in the room had never actually used their own website or app to do the thing that customers were doing. And as they did it, they got increasingly frustrated. So just putting yourselves in that category, uh, or in that mindset of the customer, it's not a perfect solution because we're always going to know more than our customers, but the more attuned you can be to that and say, well, what is our customer experiencing? Then I think the better able you are to close some of those gaps.
Yeah. That's a good idea, putting in the shoes. Absolutely. It sounds very simple, but it is surprising how many people don't. And you say, just assume that.
Well, and I will just acknowledge it's really hard.
Yeah.
Humans in general are terrible at seeing things from other people's perspectives. We try, but just the way our brains are built, we're not great at it. So it takes work to do. And I think that's something that people don't necessarily appreciate.
Yeah. Very true. So actually on the humans, we know us humans make decisions emotionally first often. And in B2B still rationally second. How have you seen that translated in B2B buying behavior?
Oh, goodness. I mean, it happens, it shows up in a number of ways. I think one of the most obvious ones is you have a gut feeling about a company or a vendor. They just feel like the right fit. You might call it cultural fit. And very often from a purely functional perspective, it's, things are pretty much the same. And so that gut feeling becomes the deciding factor. Doing some research recently too about incumbents. There's something, where we perceive it as much less risky to stick with the status quo, right? The devil that you know versus
Yep.
the devil that you don't know.
Yep.
And so trust can be, I trust that they're not going to be great in this situation, but I know that and I've dealt with it, right? So, some of it favors incumbents. But the third way that I think this comes up that doesn't get enough attention is in the internal dynamics of the buying group. Because B2B buying is what last study I read was like between 9 and 13 people.
Yeah.
And so the emotions that we have about how is this going to make me look? How is this going to affect my status? What risk am I putting myself at? Those emotions, I think, play a much bigger role in decisions and influence patterns than we necessarily account for in the conversations about trust. So it's very much about to what extent do people trust their peers in the organization to be rational and support their decisions as much as how do they trust the vendor.
Makes it so complex. It's funny, I just remembered. And this sort of irrational emotion, and I've had that experience now recently for the first time, Christmas shopping, even though it's not B2B, so bear with me. But there's a shop in the UK, and then probably more globally in airports as well, WH Smith's. It's called, I don't know if you've heard of it,
Yep.
WH Smith's. And I needed something, particular book, and someone said, oh yes, go to WH Smith's, they'll have it. So I walked down the high street to where it was, and I thought, well, I can't see the sign. I thought, where's WH? I know it's down here, where is it? And it's been taken over. But the company that took it over, and I can't remember the exact name, but instead of WH Smith, it was something like AC Jones. And I stood outside the shop and I had what you would describe as an emotional reaction to that. Because I thought, are they taking the mickey? Is it really this? And they're just copying the name. Walking in there, and it's saying it's been, we've acquired WH Smith's. But the overriding factor, it looked cheaper, I thought. But there was an emotional, irrational feeling that I had with this brand name change. But because it was so close and it wasn't, it was bizarre. It was a bizarre feeling about it. So actually, when I look at it, there was a lack of trust.
Yeah, mergers and acquisitions are a huge flashpoint for trust, and something that I was talking with a CMO friend of mine recently who's been involved in a lot of A on both sides, and something that companies don't really think about enough. There is, if you trusted the previous brand, to what extent is this company going to stick with the things? I mean, Amazon and Whole Foods here in the US is a classic example. Whole Foods had passionate brand advocates. And Amazon was really the antithesis of everything that the Whole Foods brand stood for. So when Amazon acquired Whole Foods, there's an enormous amount of distrust. It's also some of that unknown factor, right? We don't know what we don't know. Is this company acquiring it because they want to keep the spirit going? Are they just buying properties or real estate or a customer list? We don't know. So it is our brain's way of signaling, wait a minute, this situation isn't as predictable as I thought it would be.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that leads to low trust.
And in the technology space, certainly coming from a Cisco experience, the amount of acquisitions, integration we had to make, and a lot of companies I was speaking to at the moment are going through that. And there is emotion around it, some excitement, bigger. Other, if you talk to people who have been acquired, there's still a hang up. They're missing what they had and haven't yet gained from what they're going to get. So it's hard. And then how that manifests itself into the market, as you say, a lack of trust or expectations. It's It's another complex area.
It's extremely complex. And it was interesting when I ran the customer experience index at Forrester, when companies would merge, we would wait at least a year, if not two, before we changed the company name branding in the
Yeah.
index and the survey to consumers. Because when the deal sign versus
Mm,
when customers started to perceive these brands as being one and the same, there was a fairly significant delay for that. So even
yeah.
just thinking about, which brand is this that I'm dealing with? You really have to it goes
Yeah.
slower than people think.
And I'm fascinated by your opinion on what's behind the psychological conditions that causes a customer to advocate. Because I'm often asked, why would people advocate? Why would they? They're busy. Why do they take the time out? Why would they do that? Talk to me about the psychological conditions and the motivations of why someone would be one of your advocates.
A significant amount of it has to do with self identity, right? I want to identify myself as the kind of person who uses this product or service, the kind of person who supports this. So if you are someone who supports, small startups versus the Goliath in an industry, you might want to advocate for them because you're always seen as the champion of the underdog. There is also a commitment or a shared values in addition to shared identity, right? I believe that this company really cares about X, Y, and Z and wants to do things differently. And I care about those things. So by supporting them, I'm helping amplify their power. Sometimes it is genuinely, I've had a really good, consistent experience. Sometimes that identity stuff is not there, it's just functional. And if someone says, hey, who do you use for email? I would say I use Gmail. It's the old adage, no one ever got fired for buying IBM,
Yeah.
which if you're over a certain age, you would remember when that was a saying.
I do.
Yeah, there are certain tried and true companies that you're not sticking your neck out to advocate for those companies. It feels like a safe choice. But I do think what you said earlier is important in terms of, am I advocating voluntarily, spontaneously, or am I advocating when asked?
Mm.
I think those are two very different things.
And what do you think the balance should be, or what should people go after?
I think it's much more realistic to go after people who would advocate when asked. I've always wondered how NPS scores would be different if the question was, how willing are you to recommend versus how likely are you to recommend? Because I'm
Oh,
willing to
interesting.
recommend away. I am not likely to recommend them because no one is likely to ask me. And that's in a lot of industries, that's a very relevant factor. And people don't know the NPS methodology when they're answering a survey question. They answer it literally. So I think it's more realistic to aim for people who are willing to advocate. If you can get people who are truly super fans, that's great. And that is absolutely wonderful. But the things that have to come together in terms of the person being passionate about whatever the company is dealing in, we just don't all have the capacity to be that passionate about that many things.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've got to really be passionate about that. Yeah. You talk a lot about identity and belonging. How do communities, peer groups? So we've spoken about the individuals. Now we're looking at this more complexity of a community that's very active, or a peer group, maybe when you get companies get the round tables together. How do communities, peer groups, and social identity fuel modern buying decisions? So looking at that group dynamics.
Well, people absolutely trust peers more than they trust companies and marketing, right? Because in theory, the peers don't necessarily have anything to gain from recommending one company or another. And they trust them to give their honest approach. There is also a certain amount of wanting to understand. I mean, asking a peer or asking a community is an attempt to hone your prediction about, if I do business with this company, is it going to be a positive outcome? And the more like me or like my company someone else is, the more likely my outcome will mirror their outcome. So
Mm.
people are constantly looking for, that's great that you have that example. Do you have an example from my industry? Do you have an example of a company of my size? And so the ability to get people who are in similar situations to you, that data feels more applicable and more valid in, kind of predicting how things are going to come out. I think in some cases, there's also a human element if you're in a community where you know people or where there are certain people who have become trusted reviewers, that helps to lend to the credibility. We actually rely a lot on systems for referred trust.
Mhm.
I don't know the pilot flying my plane, but I trust that they've been certified by the system that does that,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
so these communities sometimes act as sources of referred trust. That if this community has collectively said, that's why we have certifications, that's why we have benchmarks, has collectively said that this is trustworthy or this does the thing that it says it does. And those communities can be formal and structured, they can be informal and unstructured.
Just want to take you back to the systems because you say companies don't have customer experience problems, they have systems problems. Can you expand on that and what a system failure might look like?
Sure, they do have customer experience problems, but very often the solution to the problem is a system. So when you look at the companies that are consistently great at customer experience, it does not happen by accident. There is a whole system of customer understanding, of design, of governance that helps ensure that the experiences are consistent. Sometimes that's a designed process. Sometimes it is a set of guidelines that employees are given and then extensive training on scenario modeling. And, here's what would happen in this situation. What do you think? Honing people's judgment and wisdom. But none of that is left to chance. And it's something that they're constantly working on trying to improve. I will sometimes talk about the fact that there's kind of two types of systems. One is reactive, the safety net, right? I get customer feedback. If I'm hearing that something is a problem, I go try to fix it. The second is a more proactive system that says, here's the experience that we have. Ideally, you've got a journey blueprint or something like that. We want to change it to add this. How do we make sure that that doesn't inadvertently cause problems and prevent them from happening before they ever get to the customer? So governance is one of those things that most people are not fans of, but I like to talk about it as checks and balances rather than, constraints or handcuffs. It's really about making sure that we don't introduce unintended consequences.
Yeah. What advice would you give to any company out there who want to sort of, given your system terminology, operationalize trust and not just talk about it? What advice do you have?
I think one of the most important things you can do to start is to co-create a definition of trust or a set of elements that define trust. There are, dozens of trust models that some have two elements, some have four, some have whatever. I think being able it is much easier to talk about whether or not we are reliable, whether or not we are empathetic, whether or not we are transparent. Those are concrete concepts that people can look at something and say, here's information we're not sharing, therefore we're not being as transparent as we could be. I think that is really the key to operationalizing trust, is to break it down into something concrete that people can act on.
Mhm.
Because trust, well, it's interesting with trust. For some people, it just feels too big and overwhelming. Other people have a very visceral negative reaction. I interviewed one gentleman who said, as soon as I brought up trust with my executive team, they were like, that doesn't matter. Don't even talk about that. That's ridiculous.
Really?
Yeah, for various reasons.
What, they didn't think they had that trust problem, or why would they have such a
They
reaction?
didn't think they had a trust problem. They didn't think trust mattered. It was the soft, fuzzy stuff. People buy us because our product has the best features. trust is irrelevant. And so I joke sometimes that the best way to get people to start working on trust is to stop talking about it. I will often tell people to replace confidence in place of the word trust.
Okay.
How
Yep.
confident are our customers that we'll share the information we need? How confident are our customers that we'll deliver on our promises? That's some of the psychology of words,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
which I'm big into
Yeah.
because it matters whether people want to admit it or not. And I frankly don't care if I get someone to believe in the value of trust. I just want them to do it.
Yeah. And have that confidence. Yeah. What's, again, with your research, what's one confident destroying behavior that you see again and again in B2B in particular?
One that came out in the very first interviews was a lack of engagement, a detachment. I heard
Between the
they're all
customer and the company? Or,
right. They're all over me when they want to sell me something,
uh,
and they hold
yeah.
my hand through onboarding, and then I don't
Yeah.
hear from them again until it's time
Interesting.
for a renewal. Disengagement. Now, on the flip side, account managers will tell you, and many did, I would love to get a meeting with the CMO, but they won't take my calls. It's about how do you be engaged and interested in the customer's business in a way that doesn't add extra work for them and isn't purely self-serving. One of the people I talked to, she finds out if her clients have a lunch and learn program and says, "Can I attend?" Those lunch and learns are happening whether she's there or not, but it's a way for
Mm,
her to learn about and understand the company and understand what they're thinking about. There's absolutely zero extra work for anybody else. That's a form
mm,
of engagement, of showing up. So that is one of them. The second trust killer, if you will, is a lack of sensitivity to what is not being said. Many companies will think, okay, here's the operational situation. These are the features they're asking for. This is this. And they'll take it very literally. I see this in particular with what I call a relationship reset when the
mhm,
main contact in the customer organization changes. Somebody leaves, get promoted, whatever. People tend to jump in and go, okay, here's why we're wonderful, without thinking about why was this person? Were they replaced? Did they leave voluntarily? What context, political context, is this new person stepping into? Do they
mm.
have something to prove? That's a particular example, but just in general, not necessarily being sensitive to things in the environment that are not being said, I think is another big place in B2B where you just come off as tone deaf.
Yeah. Yeah. Which, yeah, is not good for anyone.
Yeah.
Yeah. Especially sales. Coming to a last section, really. If companies could finally measure trust the way that they measure pipeline, what do you think that would unlock?
Well, I don't quite think you can measure trust the way you measure pipeline because trust ebbs and flows. It's fleeting. But conceptually, if they were as thoughtful and diligent about managing trust as they were about managing pipeline, um, I think one of the things that would happen, you would see less atrophy because very often, you build trust and then you don't do anything necessarily to break it. It just atrophies if you don't have that
Mm,
engagement. People would be better able to say, how engaged and proactive do we have to be to maintain trust? I think if they measured trust, they would also really start to understand the difference between the sort of functional elements of trust, reliability, and capability versus the emotional elements of trust, integrity, care, concern. I think people often shortchange those, and especially in today's highly digital environment, people are really looking for that kind of human care.
mm.
And if people measured the elements of trust, which I think is better than measuring just, do you trust us?
Yeah.
They would start to see that not only do they have gaps there, but that those things make a bigger difference, particularly in B2B, than you necessarily realize. So
Yeah.
it's hard to say. I mean, operations are always easier to manage. They're
Yep.
complex, but they're concrete. So just being able to measure would certainly not be a panacea, but I think it would open us to a lot more conversations.
Yeah. I agree. And finally, what's your prediction for the future of trust, customer experience, customer led growth, over the next decade?
I struggle with this one because I'm a realist. And so when I hear predictions that say this is the year that we're finally going to, see the breakthrough in this, it's usually not in a year. I think that the conversation around trust is going to be very heavily dominated for the next few years by cybersecurity and AI. For
Yeah.
better or worse, because those are the two sort of flashpoints. The basic elements of trust, consistency, transparency, there will be fewer companies that are kind of actively jumping into those, but the ones that do are the ones that will still be there 5 years from now. We saw this in the arc of customer experience starting in 2006, 2007. There was an inflection point around 2012. And the companies that said customer experience isn't just a catchphrase or an idea, it's really core to what we do. And they invested in it, not flashy, but very consistently and deliberately. Those were the companies that 2, 3, 4 years later were skyrocketing, companies like Delta Airlines.
Mm,
I think we're at a
mm,
similar inflection point where the people who kind of do the flash in the pan, will do it for a couple of years and then lose interest in it. They'll kind of maintain the status quo. But there will be a handful of companies that will really embrace and internalize this idea of trust as the fundamental basis of business relationships. And those companies are going to, I think, steadily will be surprised in 5 years how far they've stood out from
Yeah.
the competition, but they will have done it
Yeah.
somewhat silently.
Can you, oh no, sneak in another one. Can you give some practical, you talk about transparency and companies are consistent and transparent. Can you give an example of where you've seen a company be more transparent so we get some idea on what area they should be more transparent, for example, and how they've approached it?
Yeah, there's a couple different things in the technology space in particular, things with roadmap and how roadmap decisions are made. Don't just tell me that something I requested is or is not on the roadmap. Tell me how you made that decision. Be transparent about the decision. I still may not like the answer, but there's
mm,
something called procedural justice, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which is I'm more willing to accept the outcome if I think the process of getting there was fair.
Right.
So
Yep.
being transparent about how and why you made decisions. I think also just giving people more information about what's going on.
Yeah.
I don't know why I feel better knowing why my flight is delayed than not
Yeah.
knowing,
That's so
but for some
true.
reason I
Yep.
do.
Yep.
And that's just a human desire to, knowing feels better than not knowing. And so even if it's something you can't control, saying, here's what's going on and here's what we're doing about it, that lowers the anxiety of a stressful situation. And there's value. We can't always change the situation, but we can change how people experience the situation. And if
Yeah.
we are helping people feel less anxious by giving them more information, that is a sign of caring that builds trust versus companies that just say, oh, they don't need to know that.
Yeah. I love it. Communicate, communicate. Even
And
when you think you
communicate
have, it is.
relevant.
Yeah.
Communicate things
Yeah.
that are relevant.
Yeah.
Transparency is not about a dump of all the
Yeah.
information. It's about things that are going to be relevant and things that are going to help the customer feel more in control of the situation.
Yeah. It's a more informed decision making, isn't it? When you know, as
Mhm.
you say, you might not like what you've heard, but at least you know it.
Yeah.
And it's more informed. Yeah.
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you, Megan. That would really, really go really interesting. Yeah. So I like this change of confidence versus trust. And sometimes if you don't like that word, then change it and just put that word instead and the emotion attached around words, which I love as well. And for me, taking away that transparency. Yeah, it's good. And particularly I like the example of the roadmap. We can absolutely
Yeah.
do that and share
And
that and be
it's
more visible. Yeah.
in my model, in the model I'm building, I actually have a particular kind of transparency. I don't just talk about transparency, I talk about candor.
mm-hmm.
Candor is being transparent when you know the other person isn't going to like what you have to say.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's one of the things that as I talk to people about, tell me about your most trusting relationships, candor and a willingness to be candid was one of the key things that kept coming up. So I think that's also
Well,
an
it's just so much
important
more
piece of this.
authentic then, isn't it? Do you feel you've got the truth and you understand? Yeah.
It's taking a risk. It's being vulnerable. When you are candid with someone, we messed up. This is going to take longer than we thought. Your people aren't stepping up. Whatever it is, I sometimes relate it to relationships, right? I got married last year. And when you're in a long-term relationship, sometimes you have to be candid about things that are bothering you for the sake of airing it out and resolving it. If you're
Mhm.
in if you're going out and going to coffee with someone, and you don't have to be as candid about the fact that, how they stir their coffee drives you nuts. And so it's really about allowing yourself to be vulnerable so that you can work through issues
Yeah.
together.
And I think, yeah, you have to be brave to, I suppose, be candid in business. But certainly, if I can think forward, then yeah, you might have to be brave, but you certainly feel better when it's out in the open.
Well, and I would argue that if you are candid with a customer, and obviously there's nuances to it, and you tell them the truth and they say, "Nope, that's it," and they go elsewhere, you might not have had the capacity to have a trusting relationship with that
Yeah.
company,
Yeah.
right? They're
Yes.
not committed. So it's not a blanket, always be candid, but
Yeah.
there are certainly more situations where I think we have the opportunity to be a lot more candid than we typically are.
Yeah. Excellent. I love that. And finally, just love to end with a recommendation. It can be anything, a book, a guest I should have on, a great podcast or video you've seen, anything you would recommend for the
Well,
audience.
I'm actually reading right now a book called The Four Factors of Trust by
Oh,
Ashley Reichheld and Amelia Dunlop from Deloitte. Ashley is Fred Reichheld's,
I was going
and
to say, same surname.
yeah, same story. It's his niece. And from what I've seen so far, they have done a really good job and some thorough research about building out some practical ways of measuring trust. When
Oh,
I built the customer experience index at Forrester, it was not about we want to have our own proprietary metric. It was about how do we build a metric that is useful. And I am measurement agnostic, and they've made the questions in this open source. So I'm only about a quarter of the way through it, but it seems to be very, very trustworthy and very thoughtful and deliberate in the way they've had their approach. And if they've already come up with a methodology that works, I'd rather
yeah.
see people use that than reinvent the wheel.
Yeah. Take it. Brilliant. Thank you, Megan. Thank you so much for joining us on Trusted Voices. That was really interesting, very insightful. And personally, I've certainly taken away a couple of nuggets there. So that's great.
You're very welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.